Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Eblex Beef Teleconference, where we aim to provide practical information to beef farmers on a range of topics. This afternoon, we've got Dr. Davies from Silage Solutions, who's going to talk about silage additives, and after that, we've got Karen Stewart from SAC Consulting, who's going to be discussing the use of brewing and distillery co-products as beef feeds. Each speaker is going to talk for about 15 minutes, and then there's an opportunity to put your questions to them. So, as I was saying earlier, you can email those in or you can text me. The email address is brpconf@eblex.ahdb.org.uk, or you can text me on 07990 506 012, and I can then put your questions to the speakers. We've also produced some summary sheets, which we've called expert view sheets, which kind of summarise the main points that the speakers are making. So those are available by emailing that same email address, brpconf@eblex.ahdb.org.uk, and then you can get one of those so that you don't have to worry about writing notes or anything today. Okay, so I think that's all I need to say at this stage. We'll kick off then with Dave Davies from Silage Solutions talking about cost-effective use of silage additives. Over to you, Dave.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to start by highlighting the fact that silage additives can only do so much in terms of silage quality, and we need to really focus detailed attention on quality in terms of crude protein, D and ME in the field, matching that to the nutrient requirements of the animals we intend feeding it to, and then also focusing on all the other aspects of the silage making process, because the silage additive really is the icing on the cake. So I suppose today's question is, do all cakes need icing? And if we start from a viewpoint of a commercial cost effectiveness, I think we need to consider silage additives in two different ways. The first one is how they could possibly reduce dry matter losses, both in the silo and at feed out. And then secondly, how they can improve the quality of the silage and therefore the animal performance. And if we focus on dry matter losses firstly, maybe many of the audience will be horrified to realise that 25% of silage in a clamp never reaches the animal's mouth. And in a bale, that's a lot lower, generally around 8 to 10%. So if we assume a book value of £120 per tonne of dry matter of silage in terms of cost of production, or 12p per kilo, that's equivalent to around £36 per tonne on a fresh matter basis at a 30% dry matter silage. Our inoculant only actually costs around £1.20 per tonne fresh matter or £4 per tonne of dry matter. So as a percentage of your total silage costs, this is 3.2% of your silage making costs. And if we consider two types of losses, we have invisible losses occurring during the fermentation and storage phases. This is as the result of the production of carbon dioxide and water. And then we have aerobic stability losses, which is the heating of the silage during feed out and visible mould. Now, both of these significantly affect our costs of production. So if we break that 25% losses down, we can have up to 10% losses, invisible losses during the storage phase, and up to 15% during feed out due to aerobic stability. So for the silage additive at a cost of £1.20 to be cost neutral, we only actually need to save 33 kilograms of silage per tonne of dry matter, or 9.9 kilograms on a fresh matter basis. And that, when you consider it in a tonne of silage, is not a lot. So where do these losses, these invisible losses in terms of fermentation, occur? The main ones are coming from the production of some of the products that are undesirable in the silo: acetate, butyrate, and ammonia. And every time we produce one of these three compounds, we also produce some carbon dioxide and water. And for every gram of acetate, that's 1 gram of carbon dioxide plus water. For ammonia, it's 2.6 grams on average. So actually, for the silage additive to be cost neutral and taking in a random cost or an average cost of £1.20, we only actually need to reduce our acetate on our silage analysis sheet when we get it by 0.3 grams per kilogram of dry matter, and our ammonia by 0.6 grams per kilogram of total N. So I always get told that it's very difficult on farm to see that a silage additive has actually been cost effective. And maybe that's the reason why, because that small reduction in those two key parameters that we get off our silage analysis sheet will actually make our cost of our silage additive cost neutral. So I suppose the question is that if we can save more silage in our silage clamp by using an additive, it's not whether we should be using an additive, it's whether how much silage we need to make, if we can reduce these dry matter losses to ensure we have enough feed for our animals over the winter. So if we look at silage additives, there are a huge different range. And another one comment that I regularly hear is the sun is my additive and it's free. Well, I want to sort of dispel that, because even in good weather, ideal crops, actually a silage additive can be very, very cost effective. So if we look at the breakdown of the different additives, we've got a whole array. And are they all the same? Well, no, they're not. We have chemical-based additives and biological-based additives. The chemical additives traditionally were acid, formic, propionic acids being the main two. Currently, they're more usual as the ammonium salts of these two acids to make them more health and safety safe. There has been a new development in terms of some of the chemical salts that we can now use, nitrite, sorbate and benzoate, or in some situations just the sorbate and benzoate. Where we have the three of those different additives, actually we are inhibiting all the undesirable bacteria. Clostridia, enterobacteria are inhibited by nitrite. Sorbate and benzoate inhibit the yeast and molds. And this enables the natural lactic acid population to actually carry out the good fermentation. Then we come over to biological additives, and the biological additives over the last 15 years become much more complicated in their mode of action, and I think it's probably where the biggest misunderstanding in the industry is today. So within the biological, we have inoculants, and we also have enzymes. Much of the published research would show that enzymes, under most conditions, are actually not having any positive effect. They're not having any negative effect, but they're not really promoting a better fermentation. And that's due to the mode of action and the levels that are required to actually get an increase in sugar levels during the silage fermentation. But if we now focus on the inoculants, and here I'm going to talk about the lactic acid bacteria, we have a number of things that farmers really need to be aware of. We have within there homofermentative inoculants that just produce lactic acid from sugar. These will reduce dry matter losses. They will speed up the speed of fermentation in the silo. They will increase the levels of sugar and true protein. Not crude protein, because no silage additive can increase crude protein, but they will improve the protein quality and the utilization of that protein when it gets to the animal. So under that, we're looking at things like Lactobacillus plantarum, Pediococcus, and Lactococcus species. But also, because when we have a better fermentation, we can increase the risks of aerobic spoilage during feed-out and molds and yeast formation. Many additive companies have gone down the route of a heterofermentation, and these are things like Lactobacillus buchneri, Lactobacillus brevis, Lactobacillus kepheri. Those bacteria produce a mix of lactic and acetic acid in the silo, so that doesn't necessarily mean that you will get an improvement in the dry matter losses or reduction in dry matter losses that I mentioned earlier. And there is some evidence to suggest that in the silo they will actually increase the dry matter losses. But if they're applied correctly, they can have a positive effect on reducing losses during feed-out. So we've got a dilemma there. What do we do in terms of cost-effective additives to improve our fermentation and maintain our aerobic stability? And it would be my contention that to improve fermentation, we cannot deviate away from either the chemical salts or the acid-base additives or the homofermentative inoculants to improve that fermentation, to increase our protein quality and our sugar, to see an animal performance benefit and a reduction in the losses in the silo. It's much more questionable when we come to look at aerobic stability, whether farmers shouldn't pay much more attention to the detail of how they fill the clamp, consolidation, and how well they seal the clamp. And sealing is very important. If you remember back to putting a bale in a bag, used to blow up like a balloon. That was carbon dioxide trapped. Carbon dioxide is a silage additive for free, and I would like to see more silage clamps blow up like a bouncy castle because we've sealed them so well the carbon dioxide can't escape. That inhibits the yeast and molds very quickly, and then if in combination with the good consolidation and feeding rapidly across the clamp face and keeping a clean face, many farmers can control aerobic stability, and so they don't need an additive to control stability. However, if you're in that situation where you do need an additive to control aerobic stability, then you consider the heterofermentative bacteria, because aerobic stability losses can be very high, and when we go back to our 33 kilograms of silage per ton of dry matter to make a silage additive pay for itself, well, it's very easy to save that amount when you reduce aerobic spoilage losses. However, there are other approaches to controlling aerobic spoilage. Again, coming back to the sorbate and benzoate, they will inhibit the yeast and molds, and they can be very cost effective again in reducing those heating losses, and they can be as a part of a chemical additive alone or in combination with the homofermentative inoculants to get the benefits of the good fermentation and the aerobic stability. So I've talked predominantly during this 15 minutes about losses and how that affects silage quality and therefore cost effectiveness. But we also have to remember that by carrying out a good fermentation, we can retain more of the essential nutrients. So if I just pick on sugar, if we have a low dry matter silage, a lot of the sugar will be used. Whereas as the dry matter increases, we can retain more sugar, which will offset substitution in the feeder time with molasses. So taking an example where we went from 22, 28 and 36% dry matter, the homofermentative inoculant had 7% sugar at the low end and 160% sugar at the high end. 7%, and 16% sugar at the high end. Whereas an untreated silage was similar at the low end, because there we needed the sugar for the good fermentation, but at the high end we had 5% less sugar in an untreated silage than the homofermentative inoculant. And when you do a cost analysis on that, that'll come out at least £2 per every tonne of silage treated, over and above the benefit of the cost of the additive. The other thing to highlight also is that within silage inoculants there is a huge range of different numbers of bacteria that we apply, and there is a lot of research in the UK that shows that we need 1 million bacteria for every gram of forage, and the good additives will tell you that up front, that it's 1 million applied and you will get a benefit in terms of fermentation. Many additives apply 100,000, 200,000 or 500,000 bacteria. These are not adequate given the generally overcast conditions, poor weather conditions that we have in the UK for controlling the fermentation. So recently I did a trial looking at the speed of fermentation, and after 1 week the untreated silage was still at pH 5.8. An additive with 100,000 bacteria had a pH of 5.5. The same additive applied of 500,000 bacteria had a pH of 5.25, whereas 1 million was 4.5. And those additive companies that are selling additives less than 1 million for grass and clover silages are not really doing a good service, because we do need 1 million. And even with their own additives that they claim will have enough bacteria because they divide more quickly, well, actually, when you do the trial work with their additive at the different levels, you see a benefit where you have 1 million bacteria. So in terms of just summing up in the last minute, I think we should all consider a silage additive in a different way. If we can preserve just a little bit more of our silage, the additive will pay for itself, so it's cost neutral, and then the benefits of that improved fermentation will actually give us more payback in terms of feed value. And where we have data on some very good farm accounts, we can see generally at least a 2-to-1 payback on additive, but often even a 5, or on some occasions a 10-to-1 feed payback on silage additive. So I'd like to leave it there.
Thank you, Dave. That was great. Bang on time as well. So just to repeat, if you want to ask an email, then ask a question, it's the email address is brpconf@eblex.ahdb.org.uk, or text on 07990 506 012. And just looking at the questions that are coming in at the moment, there's one here asking about whether you should use different additives for different crops, or whether one additive would work across all sorts of different crops. So I suppose they're talking about clover and things like that.
Yeah. The question to me is, it's not about different crops in terms of crop type. It's about the dry matter of those crops. So if you've got a wetter crop, possibly I'd accept clover, because any clover silage needs a very good fermentation. So if you've got a wetter crop below 28% dry matter, then you need to be looking at a product that will definitely improve the fermentation and not compromise that fermentation just to look at improving aerobic stability. As we go above that 28-30% dry matter, then if our clamp management or some of the factors that I mentioned in terms of improving aerobic stability are beyond our control, then I would suggest that you really look hard at whether they are beyond your control. But if you are in that situation where you see aerobic stability losses, then you do need to consider an additive that will inhibit the aerobic spoilage. So one of these sorbate benzoate salt additives with an inoculant, or possibly the heterofermentative, although I prefer not to compromise the fermentation just to improve aerobic stability.
Okay, and does that apply to sort of maize silage in the same way as it does to grass silage?
It does. Fermentation in maize is a lot easier, so aerobic stability is generally a bigger target, although compaction density in a maize silage is lower. It's better. So again, the maize silage can be more aerobically stability challenged, and therefore we do need to consider those products to inhibit the stability. And just one other thing, on maize, because the fermentation is easier because of those things, that's one of the situations where 1 million bacteria is not necessarily needed. We can go with lower dose rates.
Okay. And the leguminous crops, red clover and very high content white clover crops, do they require anything specific?
Absolutely. The leguminous crops really do need these homofermentative inoculants at 1 million bacteria. In terms of aerobic stability, they are naturally more aerobically stable, so they're more forgiving for poorer clamp management, because they have some natural compounds that once they've gone through the silage fermentation actually inhibit the yeast and molds. But it's absolutely critical that we get that good fermentation, and for a red clover, lucerne, high white clover sward, I would never make a silage without an additive.
Okay. There's a question here that's sort of asking, could you use an additive as a sort of risk management strategy, and should you kind of use one all the time to kind of minimise the risk of making poor silage?
I personally think, yes, silage additives pay for themselves every time. But, and it is a big but, if your plant management is poor, your field management is poor, then you will still have big problems, because the silage additive will not cover up those problems. So if you've got those problems year on year, you're better off spending some money to try and resolve those problems first before you buy an additive. And actually, where we look at the cost benefits, the cost benefits will be greater under those ideal weather making conditions, where we've got the ideal dry matter, we've got wonderful quality crops. the payback on the additive on those sorts of crops is much, much more. And those are the times when farmers say, I've got the sun, I don't need an additive.
Yes, no. Okay, that's great, Dave. Thank you very much for that. Have we got Rebecca on the line or not? No, we haven't. That's fine. All I was going to say is we are recording.
Hello, I am online.
Oh, you are. You're there.
Indeed.
Rebecca, can you tell us a bit about where people can get to listen again, then, please?
Indeed. We have many channels on which you can find our information. I've been tweeting out the main points today, but on Monday, the recording of today's conversation will be available on the eBlex website. We'll be tweeting out the link and putting it on our Facebook page as well, so that you know where to find it.
Okay,
Thank
that's
you.
Brilliant. We'll get cracking and hand over to Karen Stewart now, who's going to talk about the use of brewing and distillery co-products as beef feeds.
Great, thanks Mary. Hello everyone. Yes, I'm going to talk about distillery and brewing industry co-products as beef feeds. As you'll know, there are many co-products from the brewing and distilling industries out there that can be useful feeds on farm, and although there are many advantages, there are also quite a few limitations to their use as well. So what feeds will suit some system will not suit others. So what I'm going to do today is just go over some of the main co-products that we come across. I'll not be able to cover them all. Some breweries and distilleries have their own kind of niche products, which I would advise you to ask your suppliers for a more detailed analysis about, but I'll go over the main ones today, and also about how to feed them and some of the limitations to their use and which products you would maybe want to go for on your farm. So to start off, I'll do the main co-products from the malting and brewing industry. From the malting process, we have malt residual pellets, which are the sprouts or the rootlets which are removed and dried from the germinating barley, and these are called malt coombs. These malt coombs can sometimes be pelleted at some maltsters on their own, but more often they are mixed together with the fine malt screenings and made into malt residual pellets. Now these are a reasonable feed, but they're slightly on the lower energy side. They're about 27% protein, just over 11 NE energy, but they're very high in fibre as well. So because of their low bulk density and high fibre content, this makes them lower in energy. You can feed up to 50% dry matter intake of them. They're probably less likely to be found on farm on their own. You find them in compound feeds more commonly. So the second co-product from the brewing industry is brewer's grains, which are when the malted barley is steeped in hot water and the sugars are extracted, the soluble sugars are extracted, and what is left over is known as the brewer's grains, and in the distilling industry it is known as draff. Now this is a really useful feed. You've got the fibre of the grain, you've got the proteins and fats and things in there. So it's a moist product, varying from maybe 23% dry matter to 28% dry matter, about 11.5 NE and about 20 to 25% protein. Now, its oil content can sometimes limit its use. It's maybe more in the dairies for butterfat content, but you don't want too much oil going into the rumen. So recommended amounts of feeding are between 2 to 3 kilograms per 100 kilos live weight. It's a useful feed, but it can go off quickly, and you don't want to be having it on the farm for any longer than a week unless you're going to be pitting it properly and storing it properly. You're going to get a lot of losses if it's not stored correctly, but I'll go into that a little bit later on. Now the main co-products from distilleries, we've got neutral spirit distilleries like for gin and vodka, there are malt whisky distilleries, and also ones for fuel, the bioethanol plants. Now I've covered draff there. It's a very similar product to brewer's grains. We also have another moist product with a liquid product with portail syrup, which is very high in protein, and it is the condensed residue that's remaining in the first still in malting malt whisky production. Now portail syrup is about 45% dry matter. It doesn't start that way. It starts off very, very wet and is dried down. It's very high in energy and high in protein, about 14 ME and about 34% crude protein. Consistency can be an issue with portail. It's very acidic, so it does keep well. It's got a pH of about 3.5, It's very good for straw-based rations because it's got a high proportion of its protein is rumen available protein, ERDP, effective rumen degradable protein. It's not so good in silage rations simply because of the nature of the protein in silage and potato syrup. It's too much of a good thing there. So my advice is to not feed any more than 1 kilo per 100 kilos live weight for cows anyway, and maybe slightly lower than that in fattening cattle rations. It's really something that has to be watched out for, not to be overfed in fattening rations. Now the final two sort of products I want to cover is wheat distillers grains and maize distillers dark grains. Now the wheat dark grains are, as I said, the grain neutral distilleries byproduct, or Vivergo bioethanol plant in Hull is another source of wheat distillers grains from their fuel plant there. Now, wheat dark grains are a very consistent, very high energy product, about 13.5 ME and about 34% crude protein. The thing that defines them from the different places they come from is their physical quality can be quite variable depending on the quality of the pelleting plant that the places have. Maize dark grains are the same sort of process as wheat dark grains, using maize, and the same again for alcohol production or bioethanol production. They are often imported, and there are some distilleries prefer to use maize here than wheat. I think it's got more efficient at producing alcohol, and the gluten there doesn't gum up their equipment and things. So maize is often the preferred cereal for that purpose. Now the problem with maize distillers grains is they are slightly higher in oil. They're over 10% oil, so this has to be taken into account when you're using in rations. And I would say they're just slightly higher in energy and slightly lower in protein than the wheat dark grains. And again, it's the physical composition of these feeds that differ from plant to plant. Up to 40% of the dry matter can be fed as wheat dark grains, and I would say, depending on what else is in the ration, due to the oil content, 25 to 40% of the dry matter for maize dark grains. And it also depends on the source what the analysis will be. There's also products from the starch processing industry as well, products like Trafford Gold. Trafford Gold from Manchester there is 50% dry matter, really high energy, 13.5 ME, about 20% crude protein, and again a product that can be pitted and sheeted and stored over the winter for feeding. When you are storing these moist feeds, likes of Brewer's Grains and Draff and Trafford Gold, it's when people are storing them for a short period of time that they tend to be maybe less careful about it. You can put a sheet over them and hide them from the weather, but that sheet, if it's not sealed correctly, will encourage yeast and moulds to develop invisible and visible nutrient loss, so and aerobic decay. So it's really important that you look after them if you're storing them for a long period of time, and I would give them as much care as you would if you were sheeting your silage clamp, at reducing the air and consolidating. So that's just a brief roundup of the main co-products that are available, and if you ask your suppliers for an analysis of where they come from, rather than using book values, that will be more useful when you're doing rations. So you've got, you're thinking about these products and you think, what is going to suit my farm, but these co-products all vary in their moisture content, their physical characteristics, keeping quality, palatability, and for handling and storage, like for the potato syrup, you need to have a tank for that, and for draff, you obviously need to be ensiling it if you're going to be keeping it a long time. So knowing what you have, knowing the analysis of it, and knowing its limitations for rations is absolutely essential. Which ones you go for really depends on your farm setup and what cattle you're feeding and what other feeds you have on farm. Moist co-products like Draff and Brewer's Grains will need a clean concreted area for dumping, and they must be ensiled and consolidated if kept a long time. The liquids, likes of the potato syrup, can appear good value for money, but if you think about transport costs and things as well, these need to be usually delivered with a full load at a time. If you're not going to use a full load quickly enough, it may settle in the tank and you could get a layer of spoilage on the top. You also have to think how you're going to feed it out. If you have a mixer wagon, that could be okay using a pipe. You need quite a thick pipe for potail, I think about 3 to 4 inches diameter. Sometimes it can get a bit thick. If you're feeding it out by hand, it's obviously going to be quite messy. So do you have the facilities to cope with this? And although they do appear good value, if you're not set up for them, the waste could impact on animal performance and actually offset the bargain price. So for beef cattle to perform well, they need an adequate supply of energy and protein, vitamins, minerals and trace elements. And what distillery byproducts and brewing byproducts provide is energy and protein sources. They don't, however, provide minerals, vitamins and trace elements. They're very poor for these. So that has to be taken into account. And if you're using large quantities of these products, then a special mineral would have to be made up. Also, determining whether they're good value for money or not, it'd be advisable to get your feed advisor or nutritionist to have a look at the relative value of them. And you can work out the relative values of these using barley and rape meal as your units for energy and protein, and seeing if they're good value for money. But this needs to be done on a dry matter basis. There's you get your draff at £20 a tonne and you think it's good value, but it's 75% water that you're carting into the farm, so that needs to be taken into consideration. So just to summarise, a few things to think about when you're using co-products. The cost, just because they're cheap, it doesn't mean that they're a bargain. Always compare them with the dry matter, on a dry matter basis, with other feeds. Think about the feeds that you've already got on your farm and how the co-products will complement these feeds. For example, if you've got a barley beef system, potail syrup might complement it, but for a protein source, if you're only feeding out every 2 to 3 days, it could go off quickly and that might cause intake problems. If you're on a silage-based system, it won't suit you, but maybe if you're on a straw-based system for suckler cows, it might suit you. Consistency of the products and consistency of the supply is important as well. A lot of these distilleries or breweries will have closures at Christmas time, and they'll have shutdowns in the summertime and things, and it's worth speaking to your feed supplier to make sure that you have product booked on in advance. It's also consistency of product for your own rations, because if you're getting one load of draft that could be falling out the back of the lorry compared to the next load that's a lot drier, it's going to affect the amount that you put in the ration. Quality assurance is also important for your own farm assurance. Although they're mostly from feed and drink manufacturers, the byproducts and co-products should be under the Universal Feed Assurance Scheme. If they're smaller breweries or distilleries, they might be under a scheme with the BSBI, which is the Brewing, Food and Beverage Industry Supplier Association. So it's just to make sure for your own red tractor schemes and such like that you're buying from an appropriate source. You've also considered the needs of the animals that you're feeding and make sure they are balanced for energy and protein. There's for fattening cattle, for example, barley is going to be cheap at harvest time, and although the likes of Brewer's Grains and Draff are cheap, they're maybe not the most appropriate feed for intensive finishing. And finally, minerals are absolutely essential. Most of the distillery byproducts are high in phosphorus, but that is about it really, very low in everything else. So it has to be considered that if you're feeding a high level of these products, then it needs to be well balanced. A general purpose mineral might suit okay if it's only a part of the ration, and then the other parts are made up from other feeds. Okay, I think that's about me.
Thank you very much, Karen. Just to point out that we have got a blend calculator on the Eblex website that does allow you to put in the price of any of these products that you might be able to get, and then it converts the fresh weight price into a dry matter price, because it adjusts for the dry matter content. So that might be useful for anyone thinking of pricing up some different options for their feed. We've also got a mini feeds directory available, which does provide more information on not only these types of co-products but other co-products. And relating to what Dave was talking about, we've got a Making Grass Silage for Better Returns manual, which is also on the website for people to have a look at if they've got more things that they like to read about grass silage. So I'm just looking now for any questions for Karen. The email address is brpconf@ebleks.ahdb.org.uk, and we have got one that's come in that sort of makes the point really that these feeds tend to be quite low in starch. So really what you were saying earlier, they're not ideal for finishing cattle, are they?
No, not ideal, no. I mean, for intensive beef rations, you're really wanting a high starch content. They can be involved in a little bit of the ration, but not. You'll certainly get lower performance if they're taking up the whole ration. And also the problem of them going off as well. I mean, people, if they're feeding every second day, and especially with fattening rations, intake is important. So that's something to take into account.
Okay. So another one slightly related to that then is, what would be good feeds as a protein source and it is in a finishing diet for cattle?
In terms of the distillery byproducts, I think the wheat dark grains and maize dark grains would be an ideal source, along with barley for finishing cattle. They're high in energy, they've got good quality protein there, and they would complement barley quite nicely.
Okay.
Or cereals quite nicely. Mm-hmm.
Some of these are quite high in NDF, so does that mean they can be used to sort of replace forage in the diet?
Yes, a lot of people say with brewers' grains and draff, they are forage replacers, but they can also be concentrate replacers. But one thing is to be thought about is that they are in long fibre for chewing for rumen functions. So I think, yes, you may be able to, if you're short of silage, may be able to eke silage out by using a proportion of brewer grains or draff. But I think I would still stick with a sort of rule of thumb of 30% of the dry matter of the diet coming from long fibre, so your silages and straws and things. I think a long time ago maybe they would say that 50% of the forage could be replaced by draff or brewer's grains, but I think it very much depends on the animals it's being fed to and what else is in the diet. But I think if you stick to the rule of thumb, 30% of the dry matter coming from long fibre, long forage, that would be a good figure to stick to.
Okay, and I know Dave was interested in this topic as well. Just thinking about the storage options for some of these moist feeds. I don't know if you wanted to make a comment, Dave.
Well, I've seen big problems on farms where they don't store properly, where you get massive heat loss, which is basically your ME vanishing, and then huge mold problems, which then can cause mycotoxins. So I totally agree with Karen. Storage is absolutely critical. And even if you're storing for a week, pulling a sheet over tightly and making sure that it's securely fastened around the edges will help to trap the carbon dioxide. And the yeasts and molds need oxygen to grow. So it's getting the sheet on and getting it well secured down to the ground so that there's no space for the carbon dioxide to escape, because carbon dioxide is heavier than air, so it tends to fall out of the front of the clamp and out of the floor, sucking more oxygen back in. So even if it is not consolidated for that week, but you get a sheet on and get it securely fastened around the edges, you will help to reduce spoilage.
Right, some good advice there. Okay, I don't think I've got any more questions at the moment. So just to thank the two speakers very much for very good presentations. What I would say to the audience who's listening, just an opportunity for me to flag up that we've got some events coming up across the country if anyone's interested. More details can be found on the website and the events calendar, but we've got a couple of events on managing beef heifers for optimum productivity in Yorkshire and Herefordshire. We've got some on better returns from controlling cattle parasites. Those are in Dorset and Cornwall. And we've got a beef selection and butchery event in Northumberland. So all of those are in June. So if you are interested in any of those, do go on the website, or you can ring the events office on 01904 771 211. Also to flag up, we have got a Beef Feeding Club e-newsletter, which is available to anyone who would like to send us their email address. So do send it through on the email that I've been talking about, and we can add you to the list of people that get that. The next teleconference we've organised is for Friday the 3rd of July, where we've got Ridian Jones from SAC Consulting, and he's going to be talking about creep feeding for suckled calves and supplementary feeding of growing cattle at grass. So we've got just the one speaker going to be covering those two topics next time, and we are not going to do a teleconference in August, but we'll be back in September. But for now, just to thank our speakers once more, and wish you all a good afternoon, and thank you for joining.